For the official opening of the reservoir, the King, accompanied by the Queen, made the 12-mile drive from Sheffield. The King first unveiled a tablet commemorating the opening ceremony. The first Derwent Valley water scheme goes back to 1889. The Ladybower Reservoir is its greatest achievement.
Yes, indeed, 1945 was a major milestone in the history of the Upper Derwent Valley, and I've always been fascinated with the story of its transformation. So, back in 1970, I spoke to and recorded some of the people who lived here and knew this valley before it became the Ladybower Reservoir.
Well, as you can see, nothing but water now, and the road on the other side. Of course, it was all green fields down the bottom.
Well, there was a farm up there at one time, and it was called Ronsley Farm.
One dropped down through heather and upland sheep farms and finally reached the rich meadows by the stream.
And now, 50 years on, I've combined those voices from the archive with images from books and the internet to mark this, the 75th anniversary of what was a truly major milestone in the story of the Lost Valley.
The 320-foot depth of water will contain more than 6,000 million gallons.
You could see the church. You could also see Derwent Hall and the village of Derwent itself, which lay down in front of us. And now, of course, anyone coming up wouldn't imagine that there'd been a village there at all.
Back in the 19th century, the Upper Derwent Valley, with its plentiful rainfall and steep sides, had been recognised as being an ideal location for impounding water. And in 1899, Parliament authorised it to be flooded, to supply much needed clean water to the ever-expanding surrounding populations. And that was despite the fact that the valley had an established population of its own.
There was houses all up there at one time, you know, right up that valley. There was Birchin Lee Farm, Mare Bottom Farm, Ronsley, West End, Bank Top, and another called Walker House. Ridge Farm, and then there was another called Shire Rollers, and Hancock. I think they'd all been like sort of small farms at some time.
George Bingham had been born in Derwent Village in 1898. And so he had an exciting boyhood, living as he did next door to what was to become a massive building site. Today, of course, there'd be so many objections that the scheme would never happen. But back then, the folk who lived in the valley didn't make a fuss, and their landlords, the Dukes of Norfolk and Devonshire, resettled them elsewhere. So, in 1900, the Derwent Valley Water Board was up and running, and it appointed Edward Sandyman as its chief engineer.
The Derwent Valley Water Act of 1899 authorised the construction of 6 reservoirs, namely the Ronsley, Howden and Derwent, to be built within 15 years, and the Hagley, Ashupton and Bamford reservoirs to be completed at a later date.
Edward Sandyman moved up to Derbyshire from Plymouth, where he'd been the borough water engineer. Although he was still in his 30s, he had a growing reputation, and it was considerably enhanced by his work on the Derwent Valley reservoirs.
The combined storage capacity of them all was to be 10,000 million gallons of water. The Ronsley Reservoir was the smallest and was to be sited above the present Howden Reservoir near Slippery Stones. However, this was abandoned and the Derwent Reservoir enlarged by making the embankment higher to compensate for the lost storage. It was estimated that these changes would substantially reduce costs, and the Act of Parliament conferring the necessary powers was passed in 1901. The stone used for the dams was millstone grit, quarried on the steep hillside between Hathersage and Grindleford.
And this is that site, Bowl Hill, as it is today, where you can still see the supports of a massive winding drum that was used to get the quarried stone safely down the hillside by means of an inclined plane railway. Between 1902 and 1910, this area was a working quarry, and it produced all the stone that built both the Howden and Derwent dams. And that stone was taken from the quarry in railway wagons down this slope, this inclined plane, on the end of a cable controlled by that winding drum. And then, from a siding at Grindleford Station, those same stone wagons were taken down the main line to waterworks sidings at Bamford. And thence to the construction sites at Derwent and Howden, along the Waterboard's own railway, the route of which is now the Thornhill Trail, going towards the Ladybower Dam. The reservoir itself has obliterated the next section of the trackbed, but at Fairholmes, just across the road from the cafe and car park, you can see the substantial footings for what was an impressive wooden trestle viaduct that took the railway over Locker Brook. And from here there's a section of the old trackbed that you can walk along because it's been turned into a path that leads to the western end of the Derwent Dam. And beyond that, the railway continued to the end of the line at Howden, going past the newly built village of Birchin-Lee, which was started in 1901 to meet a requirement in the Act of Parliament that the navvies who provided the muscle on works like this should be provided with a good standard of accommodation, be they single men in lodging houses or foremen and gangers with families. The village was described in a government report as a model of excellent provision, with all sorts of community facilities that weren't to be found in the much smaller nearby villages of Derwent and Ashipton, which is where Willis Ollerinshaw lived.
Yes, I can remember Birchin-Lee. I believe at one time there was somewhere in the region of 1,000 population in Birchin-Lee. The huts were made of largely of corrugated iron outside, lined with wood inside. And they had a nickname for it, Tin Town. Have you heard that?
They were all made, all the huts were made.
Because they was all huts, you know, with corrugated, yes, that's right.
But despite its shantytown appearance, Birchin-Lee had sewers and a piped water supply, which should have made it the cleanest and healthiest place in the valley, except for the fact that the works attracted an itinerant element who brought a real health risk to the settled community.
Before anyone could enter Birchin-Lee, there was a place just up the road here, what they called the Doss House, and they had to spend a week at this Doss House so that all the clothes were stoved and the doctors saw them regularly to see that they didn't pass any disease or fever and that sort of thing into the Birchin-Lee village.
So the Doss House, which was well away from other habitation, kept the workforce and Birchin-Lee safe from imported infections. And by all accounts, the people of Derwent and Ashipton not only tolerated, but they took advantage of their new neighbour, Tin Town.
People used to go up there and do a bit of shopping on, you know.
The parents took us, you see, up to the shop. They had 3 shops there.
And did the post office. A.F. Hancock of Bamford had several wagons running up there with groceries, paraffin and what have you, because they were all paraffin lamps. There was no electricity then. There was a canteen there, of which they could buy beer at about 3/8 a pint. And of course you can't build reservoirs without beer, as you probably know.
And there was another service that was initially provided for the navvies, but was later made available to all the locals. Although the Howden to Bamford Railway primarily carried stone, timber and coal for the building works, it also ran a daily service of open wagons, known affectionately as paddy mails, to get the navvies who lived in the Hope Valley to and from work. Then, in 1903, the railway acquired some passenger coaches, primarily for the use of bigwigs.
But on a Saturday, they had a special mail down to run all these landladies down to Bamford so that they could go to Sheffield. And people who was living up at Derwent at that time, they could travel on this train, but you had to get a pass from the office. And then you had to get from the sidings at Bamford to the station to get to Sheffield.
And you still can get to and from Sheffield by train, although nowadays the station is just a couple of unmanned platforms. Birchin-Lee Station was never more than a single platform, but a century after it was dismantled, the course of the railway can still be traced here among the foundations and earthworks, which are all that remain here of Tin Town. But the story of the workman's village lives on, through information boards for visitors, and the pen of the man who was Birchinlee's resident missioner.
The work that was done by the church to a large degree was done by a full-time lay pastor, and he spent his time with them, alleviating such conditions as he could and ministering to their spiritual and physical needs.
His name was George Eustace Sutton, and the Water Board recruited him from the Navy Mission in London. Now, I never got to meet him, but he told me, and indeed everyone else, about life in the workman's village that used to be here, in his book, The Story of Birchinlee.
When we arrived in 1902, the work on the Howden Dam had only just begun and only 40 huts had been erected. At that time there were no provision shops, and the hospital, recreation hall and school were not yet in existence. The children were literally running wild, and it was borne upon us that a mighty responsibility lay on our shoulders. So we started Sunday school on the first Sunday after our arrival.
Something the Navy Mission had done on previous occasions.
The railway was only partly made, so the materials for the dam building had been conveyed by traction engine and carts, which cut up the roads very badly. However, the scenery was divine. The River Derwent was a sight for the gods in those days, for all along its banks were avenues of trees. Very soon, though, the railway had reached the village, the trees had gone, and Tin Town housed some 900 people. The 1902 coronation celebrations were the beginning of a series of most enjoyable annual events of a similar kind. Sports Day at Birchinlee has always been a great day of the year, what with a landlady's race for the wives of the hut keepers. Extra fare was provided in 1911 on the occasion of the coronation of King George V, and then again in 1912 when the Howden Dam was opened. For the coronation festivities, fireworks were provided, but an eager helper dropped a lighted torch into the box and then gave them to us with one bang. Never mind, it caused a lot of fun both then and afterwards. A police station with 2 cells was built near the entrance to the village. But as the cells had never been occupied for 5 years, the building was converted to married quarters, with a room reserved for the village constable. The day school opened in September 1902, with 110 pupils and 1 teacher, his wife and 2 assistants, who soon got the school into working order. There were also evening continuation classes in subjects such as reading, writing, arithmetic and first aid, with which your missioner is proud to have been connected. Huge funeral processions have walked from Birchinlee to the parish church at Derwent, and it has been a common thing to see from 50 to 100 men, besides women, following a dead comrade to his last trench of 6 feet length. About 100 people from the village have been interred there during the construction of the 2 dams.
Of course, those deaths weren't all work-related. In Brian Robinson's in-depth account of Birchinlee, he tells us that Tin Town's medical officer reported that 16 deaths had been due to accidents, and unlike earlier public works, there hadn't been any multiple fatalities. Even when they came across potentially dangerous ground conditions that required extensive foundations and deep trenches for a wall of concrete that went as far as the nearest impervious rock, which the chief engineer hoped would prevent water seeping past the dam and undermining it. And 100 years on, it's clear that Sandyman's solution was a success, although at the time it was an unwelcome, unexpected expense, and it did set the project back by a couple of years. Nevertheless, the impounding of water commenced in January 1912, and the official opening of the Howden Reservoir happened on the 5th of September that year. It had been intended to be a royal occasion, but the king was indisposed, so Sir Edward Fraser, the chairman of the Water Board, did the honours. Later that month, Edward Sandyman resigned as chief engineer to go into business as a consulting engineer. His hitherto assistant Sidney Windsor took over as chief engineer, but with Sandyman retained as a consultant, it was business almost as usual. And what's more, the Derwent Dam required the same additional work as the Howden. But by the summer of 1914, that job was nearing completion. The workforce was being cut back, and Birchinley was disappearing from the face of the earth because the huts were sold off as soon as their tenants moved out. Fittingly, the last family to leave in February 1915 was that of Eustace Sutton, the missioner and writer of the story of Birchinley.
All in all, Birchinley, affectionately named Tin Town, has been a good home for all of its citizens. We trust that when Birchinley is levelled to the ground, many may look back in pleasure and gratitude to the first decade of the 20th century, and, pressing ahead in all that is pure and noble, may build up characters that shall be more stable than those huge masonry walls built by them in the Derwent Valley, and more lasting than the non-abiding city of Tin Town.
After Birchinley disappeared in 1915, it was a year before the Derwent Dam overflowed for the first time, and the Water Board began supplying 13 million gallons of water a day to the people in the surrounding cities, as well as 6 million gallons of compensation water into the river to keep it flowing as normal. Nowadays this is just an overflow into the Ladybower, but the outlet valves here controlled the flow of water past Chatsworth and beyond when the dam opened in 1916. A year later, both Sheffield and Nottingham requested more water. Now, this should have triggered the construction of the Phase 2 reservoirs in the Ashop Valley. But by then, the engineers had discovered that the ground conditions there were even worse than at Howden and Derwent. So, as an interim solution, some of the water from the Ashop Valley was diverted through a tunnel and aqueduct into the Derwent Reservoir so that it was able to supply the extra water for Sheffield and Nottingham. But Derby and Leicester were also entitled to ask for more. So, in 1920, they unfurled a plan that Sandyman had suggested back in 1900. It was the Ladybower Reservoir, which, when eventually constructed, would flood the rest of the upper Derwent Valley, including the two villages of Derwent and Ashopton.
Ashopton and Derwent lived very, very much together, really. There's the Church of England at Derwent and a Roman Catholic place at Derwent. Well, we used to have dances and whist drives in the Church of England school, which was lower down again, which is now submerged. And in Ashopton itself, there was the Ashopton Inn, quite a big pub. There was a general store shop, there was a joiner's shop, there's a Methodist chapel there, of which we were more or less all brought up in, and we used to have what they term as a bachelor's tea, and all the bachelors in the village did all the cutting up and the serving of the tea, actually, and the proceeds of that went to the National Children's Home and to the Sheffield hospitals. And we had a cricket team in the Derwent village, played down here in the Duke of Norfolk's parkland, and the population of Ashopton, Derwent and the woodlands all seemed to fit in very, very well together, really.
However, in 1920, none of them seems to have been too worried about the impending storm that was the Ladybower Reservoir. Now, possibly that was because they saw it as simply a future aspiration rather than a done deal. But the truth is, a deal had been done. But contrary to popular belief, it wasn't the Duke of Norfolk who had done it. True, the 15th Duke had bought Derwent Hall back in 1876, and he'd upgraded it into a seat that was fit for nobility, but he'd done it for his younger brother, Lord Edmund Talbot, to whom he gifted the property. So, when the 15th Duke died in 1917, Derwent Hall wasn't inherited by the 16th Duke because it belonged to Lord Edmund, the young Duke's uncle. Now, throughout the dam building years, Uncle Edmund would have frequently been absent from this part of Derbyshire because he was an MP for Chichester on the south coast, and he rose through the ranks, both military and political, until in 1921 he became Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, with an official residence in Dublin Castle. So he would have spent even less time at Derwent Hall, especially since this was the height of the Irish War of Independence. Now, the fact that he, representing the Crown, was a Catholic may have helped to broker the truce which led to the creation of the Irish Free State, and an end to the Lord Lieutenant's role. So he returned to England, where he retired not to Derwent, but to this splendid pile in Windsor Great Park. All rather ironic, because he'd been rewarded for his historic role in Ireland by being elevated to the rank of Viscount Fitzalan of Derwent. Now, unlike that ancient name, Ashopton was a recent addition to the map, having been coined for a toll gate on the Snake Road when it opened in 1821. There soon followed an inn, a chapel, and a couple of shops, and Ashopton became a watering hole and staging post for travellers to and from Manchester, as well as a popular destination for day trippers from Sheffield.
I can go back far enough to remember the coach and 4 horses coming from Sheffield to Ashopton during the summer months, and people would spend something like 3 hours in Ashopton while the horses were fed and rested a bit, and then away they went back again.
The completion of the Howden and Derwent dams certainly attracted lots of visitors to the area, but for the locals, people like the Binghams who lived in Derwent village, it meant a loss of convenience, because once Birch and Lee disappeared, they could no longer just pop next door, as it were, to do their shopping.
There was a grocer's shop at Ashopton. That was 1.5 miles to walk, yes, but of course we used bicycles in those days.
And travellers came, Tuckwoods, and from Sheffield they used to come, and then they delivered the groceries for us.
You had to buy a month's groceries in those days.
Then they changed and came fortnightly.
Yes, and then they came fortnightly.
And surprisingly for such a small isolated village, Derwent was on the telegraph network, which largely followed the main railway lines. But thanks, no doubt, to the Duke of Norfolk buying Derwent Hall a few years earlier, the wires had found their way to the village back in the 1880s. So, when George Bingham returned home from the First World War and became the village's sub-postmaster, he was taking on a long-established role that involved more than just sitting behind a counter.
Yes, I had a posting round, yes, around about 20 places. I think it wasn't very big, but they scattered, you know, climbing up the hills where I went. Not many roadsides.
You were the only postman in the area?
I was at Derwent, just at Derwent, yes.
You didn't go to Ashopton?
No, they had one at Ashopton, what they call an auxiliary postman. Station man from used to do it on a push bike. Well, then after that, the Sheffield started coming out with the motorbikes and pannies, and then they got to sidecars, and now they have vans, and then they used to bring our letters out to Derwent, like for me, my delivery, we had to take them from them, you see, and then they delivered right up the Snake and up there. Well, of course, in those days we used to get telegrams, you know, and we used to have to deliver them, and I used to go right up the woodlands on a push bike in those days, and there were some long wait journeys, wasn't there?
What happened to the post office when you were off delivering a telegram?
Well, my sister had, she was in. Yes. Not this one, I had another one. but she's passed away since we come here. And she used to be inside, and I was delivering. Yeah, I used to have to take them out, and she, of course, there always had to be two of you. And of course, this one was at school. She used to help at holiday times, and
She used to help when he went. If I had a holiday.
she did most of the accounts on a Saturday night. I used to have to rely on her for that.
In September 1929, Dr. Bemrose, the chairman of the Water Board, officially opened the new filter house at Yorkshire Bridge, which, along with these weirs in the Ashett Valley, comprised Phase 2 of the Derwent Valley Water Scheme. This had been started in 1920 to divert extra water into the Derwent Reservoir so that it could provide more for Sheffield and Nottingham. But it was never going to be enough to supply Derby and Leicester with their full quotas, so sometime in the future the Ladybower Reservoir was going to be needed. The Water Board had already sounded out Viscount Fitzalan about selling Derwent Hall, so when he moved to Windsor they bought it from him to clear the way for the reservoir. They had hoped to let the hall out commercially until it had to be demolished, but it lay empty until 1932, when the newly formed YHA offered £50 a year to lease part of it as a youth hostel. The offer was accepted, and 3 months later it was opened by the Prince of Wales.
I'm sure the Youth Hostels Association is extremely fortunate in having this fine old house and grounds at their disposal.
The Prince's Guard of Honour reminds us that the Water Board's Dr. Bemrose was also the Scout Commissioner for Derbyshire, so he at least would have been keen to see Derwent Hall being used as a centre for outdoor activities.
Not only a youth hostel, I think many of the unemployed chaps out of Sheffield used to come and spend a fortnight there in summertime. And they used to walk regularly, of course, over the top of the hills where the footpath comes over from Sheffield, via Strines Road end and down to Derwent. And of course there were no trees planted before these dams were made. You can see all the forestry on the other side. Trees which of course have grown quite well, and trees which look very well and have done very well. But to me, of course, it's nothing like it was before.
And for local farmers like Ray Ollerinshaw, later of One Man and His Dog fame, and indeed everyone else who read the daily papers, that change to this part of the valley was signalled in January 1934 when Leicester and then Derby requested their full quotas of water. Sidney Windsor, who had been the Water Board's deputy and then chief engineer for over 30 years, had just retired, and his deputy, R.W.S. Thompson, took over. Now, unlike Howden and Derwent, the Ladybower Dam was to be an earth embankment, and rather than being direct labour, the job was put out to tender, and Richard Bailey of Haddington near Edinburgh won the contract in September 1935. It was a time of high unemployment, so there was tension about where the workforce would be recruited, and although most of the labourers came from Sheffield, Bailey did bring many of his own skilled men from Scotland to work on this major project, which inevitably attracted a lot of coverage in the press.
This is the site of the new Ladybower Reservoir. Construction work is well underway. Although the plans were originally made in 1920, it was only 2 years ago when Derby and Leicester applied for more water that the people of the valley learnt of this massive artificial lake which is to flood their homes. Many buildings are below the top water line and are scheduled for demolition. There is speculation as to whether the Derwent Vicarage, which, when the work is completed, will stand with its feet almost in the water, will be spared or not. However, the main part of Derwent is doomed, including the church, the village school, the ivy-covered post office and Derwent Hall, one of the most beautiful buildings in the High Peak. The Water Board purchased it in 1927, and since 1932 it has been a popular youth hostel. Before the church is demolished, the graves in the churchyard will all be opened and the bodies reinterred at Bamford.
About 100 of them were originally from Birchinley, and one of them was the wife of the Navy Missioner Eustace Sutton. After leaving Birchinley in 1915, he had become the secretary of the Leeds Church Institute, and when he died in 1931, he returned to Derwent to lie alongside his wife, Sarah. So, in 1937, when the Water Board bought the church and churchyard, it became responsible for reinterring the 300 bodies, including the Suttons, who were buried there. But it turned out that there wasn't enough room in the churchyard at Bamford, so they paid for an extension to the consecrated grounds, and in the spring and summer of 1940 the exhumations and reinterments took place. They also moved the granite cross that commemorated the Birchinley dead in the Derwent churchyard.
The inscription is still legible and reads as follows: erected by Derwent Valley Waterboard workmen and friends to the memory of those women and children of Birchinley and of all the men employed on the construction of the Howden and Derwent reservoirs who died AD 1901 to 1912.
And it's fitting that Eustace Sutton, who was such a central figure in the story of Birchinley, is remembered here too. The Ladybower Dam is 140 feet high, but it stands on a solid watertight concrete foundation that's 200 feet deep, and then some.
After the concrete had been poured, the tubes were left through the concrete, after which drilled to depth of about 800 feet, and we injected cement grout into the strata below the concrete trench to fill up all the fissures, so that it was impossible for the water to get underneath the concrete trench. The dam itself was made with a core of puddle clay, and on the side against the water we had stone pitching, which came from Ladybower Quarry above the Ladybower Hotel.
So that was taken to the dam by road, but to get the clay from the Hope Valley to site, they reinstated a section of the old railway from the Bamford sidings to Yorkshire Bridge. Before the war, some 200 labourers from Sheffield travelled out every day in 4 double-deckers. This is what they looked like when they were brand new, but the Ladybower contract wore them out, and the slightly younger buses that replaced them during the war. However, compared with the open wagons that were provided for the Howden and Derwent navvies, things were much improved for this generation of labourers.
They were issued with passes, and of course the conductor's job was to inspect these passes each morning as they were going out. Well, of course at that time chaps would sometimes go out there for a job, riding for nothing, going out to get a job. So you walk down the bus, passes please, I must see your passes please. There were various comments, pass him out the window, pass him down the so-and-so bus, and this was the kind of thing that you sort of met.
But we had quite a few skilled men too who lived on the site. We had a little village, a workman's village called the Nangate, which was called after a part of the town of Harrington, where most of the skilled men who we took down originally came from. And we had a canteen for the men there, and sleeping huts as well.
But in 1939, everything changed.
It took us about 6 or 8 months after the war started to sort of get some momentum going again, with labour imported from Southern Ireland and stonemasons from Cornwall.
So, slowly but surely, the work continued, under the watchful eyes of not only Richard Bailey Sr., who sometimes had time to record the progress in oils on canvas, but also those of the Sheffield bus crews.
But it was customary when we got to the dam itself, the drivers got out and had a chat, had a look round to see how the dam was progressing. And when they was building the wall across the dam, and they puddle it with clay, they tread it in. So you can just imagine when they stomped on the bus like that, what the bus floor was like. They had to hosepipe them out straight away at Townhead before they could do anything. But they got into such a state, these buses, they began at the latter end to do nothing else, only just run for Derwent.
As well as building the dam, they had to update the Bamford filters and enlarge the aqueducts to cope with the increased water supply. New roads were needed, and properties that were going to be flooded were demolished. The people who were displaced were rehoused in a new estate at Yorkshire Bridge, where many of the specialist contractors stayed whilst they were working on the project, including the viaducts. Wartime problems with raw materials for these structures meant that in the 90s they had to protect the metal frameworks from corrosion, but that hasn't affected the image of the Ashipton Viaduct skimming gracefully across the water, a view that everyone recognises. The credits for the design of the viaducts go to David Anderson and William Key, who, incidentally, was also the architect for those houses at Yorkshire Bridge. Ashipton Methodist Chapel's last service was in 1939, but it soldiered on with the Home Guard based in the old building until 1943, by which time Ashipton wasn't so much a village as a viaduct. At the same time, another local bridge was also in the news, but for rather different reasons.
Just before the war, we raised £1,000 to dismantle the Packhorse Bridge. The stones were each carefully numbered, and the late Mr. Ronald Wilson housed them in a stone shed, free of charge, not too far from the site where the bridge was to be re-erected.
The plan to rebuild the bridge at Slippery Stones was audacious, costly, and inevitably delayed by the war, which, when it started back in 1939, had caused the closure of Derwent Hall Youth Hostel, so that girls from Sheffield's Notre Dame School could be evacuated there. It was away from the bombs, but the winters were cold and damp, so after a couple of years the staff and pupils went back home, and the youth hostel reopened for a final 13 months before, in 1943, the hall and its Catholic chapel were stripped out and demolished by Henry Boot and Sons, with a little help from George Bingham.
I didn't work there long. It was the foreman that came round, and he said, "We're coming to take all the panelling out." And he said, "Would you like a job?" I said, "I wouldn't mind. I used to book it down, check it, you see, as it went in."
Charles Boot, who ran the business, lived at Thornbridge Hall, and some of the panelling that didn't get sold finished up there.
And I know I went to Thornbridge Hall once or twice, but they didn't bother with any of the stonework because they put the winch on when they got all the inside what they wanted, and they winched it over and left it.
Boots was also involved with the demolition of Derwent Church, and that work started in March 1943, just days after the last service, which was led by the Bishop of Derby and the Vicar of Derwent, the Reverend Walter Rouse. It was attended by locals and officials from the Water Board, but not the chairman, Sir Albert Ackley, who the following day closed the outlet valves to commence the filling of the reservoir. The church service had also been attended by some visitors from Freshville, a housing estate on the edge of Sheffield, and they had to walk all the way from Bamford Station because the service bus to Derwent didn't run on Wednesdays, and soon it wouldn't run into Derwent or Ashipton at all.
I did drive the last bus that run along the river to Derwent before they opened the new road and started filling the dam, and that way I remember it quite well because that morning it was flooded.
Well, that must have been due to rain rather than the reservoir filling, because the valves had only been closed for 9 days. But on March the 27th, 1943, we have photographic evidence of Derwent's very last bus and crew, along with their manager and 4 or 5 passengers at the Derwent terminus, close to where the Packhorse Bridge had once stood, with the roofless Derwent Hall in the background. From then on, all traffic, including buses, used the new roads and viaducts, and the villages of Ashipton and Derwent were consigned to the encroaching waters. But the fate of Derwent Vicarage was still in the air, and for the time being the Water Board allowed the newly retired vicar to continue living there. Sadly though, this concession only lasted for 2 years, because he died just 3 months before the opening of the reservoir. And now all that remains of the vicarage are these gateposts. But several parts of Derwent's mid-Victorian church have survived, and just like those oak panels from Derwent Hall, they've spread all over the county. Closest to home are these Kemp stained glass panels from the east window, and they're now here in St Michael and All Angels Church at Hathersage. Along with stone from Derwent Church, which was salvaged to build this 1950s vestry. Derwent's font was also here for a while, but since 1978 it's been at Holy Trinity Church in Tansley. And the precious Elizabethan silver chalice now lives in Sheffield Cathedral. And Derwent's bells also found new homes.
There was 4 bells, and they were lovely tone bells too, wasn't they? Mm-hmm. And it said on them, "Tailors of Loughborough made us, and Colonel Cavendish of Darley Abbey gave us." He gave so much money towards them. And they only used to have 1 bell at one time in the church. Mr. House told me that. And the bell, what they used to have, the old bell, it was in the vicarage, and they used to use it as a dinner gong. But they had 4 lovely bells, hadn't they?
And then Boots took them down.
Boots took them down, and nobody seems to know where they went to.
So I checked with Clive Thrower, who's an authority on church bells in the Derby diocese, and he told me that one of the bells went to Scarcliffe, another to Chaddiston, whilst the other 2 bells went to Chelmorton. In 1960 this pair went back to tailors to be recast, and the new inscription relates back to the original one. But the main beneficiary of Derwent's demise was this 1930s housing estate in Sheffield. And money from Derwent paid for this red brick church, which replaced this pre-war wooden one. It still houses the organ and several of the pews from Derwent, as well as reminders of its benefactor on the vicarage garden gates and over the church's west door. In the summer this place is light and airy, but in the winter it can get very cold, and it's much too big for the small congregation. So they're planning to revamp the church hall, which is just round the corner, so that services can be held there. And then who knows what will become of this red brick white elephant. But it's not just the church that connects Freshville with Derwent. Charles Boot played a big part in the construction of one and the destruction of the other. Grainfoot Farm, halfway between Derwent and Ashipton, was also on that list of properties that were for the chop because it sits just below the high water line, and Richard Bailey Jr., who was the contractor's agent, moved in with his young family from the start of the war until the waters got too close for comfort, an episode that left a lasting impression on his young daughter.
We lived in a fabulous place in a farmhouse which was called Grainfoot, and eventually we had to leave because the water was coming up so close and it was left derelict. And it was particularly sad because it had been a very, very happy place for us. It was the only home I knew, and it was a sort of daily occurrence that my mother and brother would go down every day to the edge of where the reservoir was, and we'd stick a stick into the ground. And when we went back the next day, of course, the stick by then had disappeared, and we put another one in. And this was the way that we then, as children, realized that the reservoir was coming up closer and closer, and it was a valley that was being flooded.
From March 1943, with the outlet valves closed, the reservoir slowly began to fill, and by the summer of 45, the water was halfway up the legs of the 130 feet high Ashipton Viaduct. And so the Water Board planned for an official opening of Ladybower that autumn. And this time, unlike the Howden and Derwent dams, it was to be a royal occasion. part of the King's celebratory visit to the Sheffield area on September the 25th. On the day, the royal party drove out from Sheffield and were met by Water Board members and officials.
And they proceeded up to the top dams. The King planted a tree. I think it was a copper oak, and I think it's still there to this day.
Although it's now called the Royal Oak rather than the King's Tree.
Then they came back down to the dam, and then my daughter, she presented the bouquet.
Well, I remember getting up in the morning and realising that something special was going to happen, and this was the fact I was going to present a bouquet to the Queen. And we stood and watched the King and Queen. They got out of their cars. My coat was taken from me and it was so cold. And this was for me to start and do my presentation. I had to walk, I remember, so many steps across to where the royal party stood. I curtsied and presented it to her, and she thanked me for it and asked me how old I was, if I had any brothers or sisters. And she remarked on the fact that the flowers were exactly the same colour of my dress, which I agreed with. And then she sort of said, "Would you like to meet my husband?" And I, of course, said yes, I would. And she turned around and said, "This is the King," and he sort of smiled. And I sort of remembered not to turn my back, and I had to walk backwards and then curtsy, and then go back to where my grandmother stood again, collected my coat, and then that was my part over. I was finished.
Later, the King deposited a copper cylinder under a 3-ton block of stone containing newspapers and coins of 1945.
This is the plaque we laid, and this is the hammer that the King, His Majesty, tapped the stone with to say, "I declare this stone well and truly laid." The King handed back to me and he said, "Oh, I hope you'll have it, keep it as a souvenir and have it suitably inscribed." So thank you, Majesty, I will.
The 320-foot depth of water will contain more than 6,000 million gallons. Many people brave transport difficulties to see the King open the valves to release the first head of water. Sheffield, Derby, Leicester and Nottingham will draw water from the Ladybower reservoir. An impressive conclusion to 9 years of engineering skill.
And so what was then the nation's largest reservoir was officially open. But of course, there was still another couple of years of work to be done to complete the job, not to mention another tunnelling operation, this time from the River Noe into the western arm of the Ladybower to collect water from the Edale part of the Derwent catchment area. Throughout 1945 and 46, the water level in Ladybower continued rising until it first overflowed in January 1947. Back then there were inspection walkways around each of the overflow shafts, but they restricted the flow of water, so they were removed in the early 1960s. Throughout the spring of 1947 the reservoir was full, and only the top half of the church tower was visible, a sore thumb of a landmark that nevertheless attracted thousands of visitors who came to mourn the demise of a once picture postcard village in a setting that Ethel Haythornthwaite described as a landscape
like an earthly paradise. To supply the needs of the towns, the land is now made sterile under a huge flat sheet of water. Concrete viaducts and the adjoining hills are darkened by rows of conifers. All this nevertheless has its public appeal. Hundreds of cars come out for their inmates to gaze on the scene, unaware of the glories that had been drowned.
Only the top of the church spire remained visible as the village became a lake. Today the water has cleared. Accessible again, Derwent Church saw its first visitors since the last ever service in 1943. The reason for this sudden emergence was a 50-foot drop in the upper reservoir. In a district where the annual rainfall is nearly 40 inches, a long drought caused this to happen. December may bring a rise in the water.
But it was the ever-rising numbers of post-war motorists causing traffic congestion that most concerned the Water Board, not to mention the pollution caused by people who didn't just visit the ruins, but paid a visit when they reached the privacy of the old church tower. And so the board meeting on November the 27th decided that it should be demolished. And it met its Waterloo on Sunday the 14th of December.
There was one thing the Council for the Protection of Rural England and other countryside organisations were able to save. We were allowed by the Water Board to dismantle the Packhorse Bridge. The stones were each carefully numbered, and the actual rebuilding was done by the famous firm of Messrs. Husband and Son at their own expense. But it was not till 1959, after 20 years' effort, that this took place. On a fine day in September, the Right Honourable Hugh Molson MP opened the resurrected bridge before an assembled crowd who knew and loved the valley in the past.
It is the mark of a cultured nation to care for the relics and monuments of its past. And it's good to see this ancient monument, this Derwent Packhorse Bridge, still standing here at Slippery Stones on the 75th anniversary of the opening of Ladybower.